And on the line with us this morning, Randy Roberts. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. And we're talking about something that is really, really cool. It is a book that Randy has written. It's called War Fever, Boston, Baseball in America in the Shadow of the Great War. Randy, of course, working with his partner, Johnny Smith. We had him on the air a couple of years ago talking about Mickey Mantle in 1956. We're going to go back a little bit further than that. Randy, good morning.
Todd, it's great to be here.
It's good to have you with us again. A new Ken boy back on the air with us, huh?
Absolutely. So you'll forgive me if I say Washington instead of Washington.
We understand completely. This is a fabulous effort that you've put forth here. War Fever, Boston, Baseball in America in the Shadow of the Great War. That word fever probably has more significance now than you realized when you were writing the book.
Well, we realized when we were writing the book that the entire kind of year of 1918 that there was an epidemic, a pandemic coming that really breaks out at the beginning of the year, January, February, and the spring. And so we knew that was going on, and it hits Boston and just it comes back and just is the killer pandemic that we know in right at World Series time. So we knew all that. What we didn't know is how timely it would be that we were going to be going through the same thing, or not nearly as bad, but close to the same thing today.
Now, you're going to put us in touch with three fellows, and we want to talk about them in just a second. But I want you to take me back right now. I was at Boston Common this past summer. We did our vacation trip there, and what an amazing place it is. It's so full of life, but 1918 even more so. Put me on the Boston Common in 1918. What am I experiencing?
1918, you're experiencing, at first, some protests against the war, but mostly you're experiencing recruitment, war recruitments. It's the vibrant center of Boston at that time. It's crowded with posters, with signs, with recruitment offices. It was just buzzing throughout the year.
Just amazing. And so we meet these three gentlemen. One of them we've heard of a lot, of course, is a guy by the name of Babe Ruth. The others, Carl Mook, German conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Charles Whittlesea, who becomes a war hero, one of those most unlikely war heroes that we read about with, it seems, every war, but Charles Whittlesea is certainly one of those. Why did you pick those three gentlemen?
Well, we picked three people that were tied to Boston. So the book is kind of centered in Boston to a great degree. So Whittlesea went to Harvard Law School. Mook directed the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And, of course, Babe Ruth was the star at the beginning of the year, pitcher who transitions to a batter that year for the Boston Red Sox. And we wanted to pick a person who was made by the war, who the war changed him, and he was made by the war, a person who was destroyed by the war, a celebrity who was destroyed by the war, and another celebrity who was both made by the war and destroyed by the war.
That middle person was Carl Mook, the German conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He was a superstar of the First Order when the war broke out, but it quickly broke down for him, didn't it?
It did. When the war broke out, he was probably America's greatest, most famous conductor. He was German, as was many of the orchestra. The players in the orchestra were German. Germany was considered kind of the best when it comes to symphony orchestras and music. If you're playing Beethoven or Brahms or the classic musicians. Anyway. Yes, he refused early on. He didn't refuse, but he was accused of refusing to play the national anthem, and when they played in the Providence, and he didn't refuse. It wasn't on the schedule. Nobody told him to play it, so he didn't play it. So he's suddenly branded, and at this time when we're at war with Germany, he's branded as anti-American, and then somebody accuses him of being a spy. He wasn't a spy, but he's quickly arrested, he's interrogated, and what the government finds out is that he did have a secret past. It had nothing to do with spying. It had nothing to be disloyal with America, but there was a problem that he has. Anyway, he ends up in a detention camp, and so he's going to spend the war in an internment camp. It will destroy his career. It will break him as an individual. It's a experience of it tells the story of what happened to some German Americans. Many German Americans. When we think of internment camps, we think of World War II and we think of Japanese Americans. Mm-hmm. Well, German Americans were interned in World War I, and we wanted to give some sense of that story.
One of the interesting aspects of all of that is, of course, there's so many parallels to today's world when you think about the pandemic back then, but there are certainly in the story of Karl Mook with today's world and the way that hysteria grips a nation, and all of a sudden people who are innocent of what they are accused of get swept away by public opinion, and today it's even easier than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing this with some Chinese Americans today, and Chinese visitors are suddenly being accused of carrying the virus, and there's been problems. Now, we're not interning anybody yet, but certainly the problems will reappear in times of crisis.
Tell us about Charles Whittlesea. He's the second of the gentlemen that you describe in this book, and his story is amazing as well.
Whittlesea is just an amazing character. He's educated at Williams and then law degree at Harvard. He's an intellectual more than anything else. He becomes a Wall Street lawyer in New York, a successful lawyer. He's a socialist for a while, but he goes against socialism eventually, which opposed the war. And then when America suddenly was threatened by the war, after the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat, Whittlesea goes into doesn't go enlist yet, but he's trained for the Army. He goes to a movement, what's called the Plattsburgh movement. And then once America's in the war, he goes into the Army too. And he's at first he works at a staff position, and then once he's overseas, because of American losses, he gets a field command. And he commands a group of regiment size, of battalion size. And he's told, when things are going bad in this Moose-Aragon offensive, which was the greatest offensive America's ever been involved in any of its wars, just a huge offensive that most Americans don't know about today. But he's told, okay, go to this position. Don't worry about losses. Don't worry about your flanks. And he goes to exactly where he's supposed to go. And suddenly, neither side, his flanks do not get there. And he's quickly surrounded. And he's forced into this area at the bottom of a deep ravine called the Pocket. And he's got about 700 men with him. And it's just, he's surrounded. They're attacked constantly. They're attacked by mortars, by artillery pieces. At one time, their own country, their own forces shoot them by call artillery into their position by mistake. And he refuses to surrender. And towards the end, the German commander says, look, sends a message to him. You've got to surrender. You've just got to surrender for the sake of humanity. And he just ignores it. But the rumor goes around that he said, go to hell. Well, he never said that, but he becomes known as Go to Hell, Whittlesea. And finally, he's rescued. Only less than 200 Americans are able to walk out of the Pocket from the 700 that were there initially. So this becomes a big story. He returns to America. He's a hero. He's the first Congressional Medal of Honor winner to be awarded in World War I. Everybody knows his name, but his story, his crisis is really only beginning. What happens to him after he comes back is one of the saddest episodes that I've ever written about.
One of the interesting aspects of that is we think about the Vietnam being the first television war where we were following the story every single night on our nightly news. People were following the Lost Battalion in much that same way back in 1918.
Yeah, it was the biggest story. Will they be rescued? What's happening to them? Are they surviving? Are they holding out? And what happened in that Pocket? You can only imagine being trapped for 5 days with nothing to eat, virtually nothing to eat. To get water, to get something to drink, you had to go down to a stream that opened you up to withering attacks and gunfire and machine gun fire. They went in. They had no blankets, no overcoats. It's cold. I've visited there several times, but one time I was there. It was literally 100 years after the Pocket. So this was a couple of years ago in 2018. and it's in October, and it's cold in October in that part of France, and so they were exposed to the elements. It's just amazing, an amazing story.
All right, so one more aspect of this book, and we're talking with Randy Roberts this morning. The book is War Fever, Boston Baseball in America in the Shadow of the Great War. We only have a few minutes left, but there's this fellow Ruth. I think we've heard of this Babe Ruth character guy before.
Yeah, I've heard of him before, but at the time, in 1918, you only heard of him as a pitcher, probably the best left-handed pitcher in baseball. But in 1918, Boston faced a crisis. They lost 11 players to the draft and to the industry work at the beginning of the season. They lacked batters. And Babe Ruth, they thought, well, let's try this guy, because he was always known as he could really hit the ball. He swung differently than anybody else. This is an age of small ball. It's the dead ball era in baseball. You just tried to get on base. You bunted, you choked up on the bat, you slapped the hit to get on base. Then they tried to move you around, and runs came slowly. Babe Ruth held the bat down at the nub, swung as hard as he could, missed sometimes by 2 feet, but when he hit the ball, it went a long way. He's probably the first player in baseball that really, literally tried to hit home runs. Generally, home runs were miracles, were accidents before that time. And so Babe Ruth he's called upon to be a batter, and he starts hitting home runs, and he likes batting. And he has a fight with his manager. His manager says, no, you're a pitcher, you're not a batter. And Babe Ruth, he saw how the crowd thrilled when he hit home runs, and he wants to be a home run hitter. This is the year that Babe Ruth transitions from being a pitcher to a hitter, to a home run hitter. And in the process, he revolutionizes the game of baseball. Suddenly now it becomes all about being a long ball hitter.
He's Randy Roberts, Distinguished Professor of History at Purdue University. He and Johnny Smith have written this great book, War Fever, Boston Baseball in America in the Shadow of the Great War. Got to tell folks, Randy, you and I just hooked up last week, so I didn't have a chance yet to read the book except for some small excerpts of it, but I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you for joining us this morning. This has been fun.
Todd, it's been great.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.
All right, bye now.
Bye.
There's Randy. He's from New Kensington originally, and the book is called War Fever, Boston Baseball in America in the Shadow of the Great War.